Mist hung over the water like a curtain the morning Hemlock Isle first drew the world's attention. The island sat only a few miles off the main coast, yet it felt far more distant, separated not just by ocean but by decades of uneasy silence. Hemlock Isle was the kind of place people noticed on maps but never talked about. Even seasoned fishermen refused to steer near it, claiming their compasses spun strangely whenever they approached. Most chalked the superstition up to old sailor tales, but others quietly insisted the island had a darkness that could not be explained by magnets or mist. Over the years, it became a place avoided not out of fear of danger, but out of fear of recognition, an unspoken agreement that Hemlock Isle was best left alone. This uneasy balance remained undisturbed until Bolden Marris, a well-known adventure photographer, announced that he was planning to document America's most secluded landscapes. Bolden had built a reputation for entering places few people dared to explore. His work often featured icy cliff edges, abandoned military bases, and deep desert caves. He believed Hemlock Isle would be a perfect addition to his project, describing it on his travel map as a final frontier of forgotten land. Friends warned him that the island wasn't worth the trouble, but Bolden never turned away from a challenge. His followers expected dramatic photos of storms, wildlife, and crumbling structures. No one imagined Hemlock Isle would become his last known destination. Bolden arrived on the mainland 2 days before his planned trip. Locals noticed his energy fade the longer he stayed. Normally talkative, he became unnervingly quiet whenever anyone mentioned the island's name. Some who saw him at the harbor later recalled the way he watched Hemlock Isle through the fog, not with excitement, but with a kind of uneasy fascination, as though something on that land pulled at him more strongly than curiosity alone. Despite this strange mood, he departed at sunrise, rowing toward the faint outline of trees rising from the water. That was the final moment anyone saw him alive. Hours later, Bolden sent a brief message from his satellite device. It contained no photos, no descriptions of scenery, and no jokes as he usually included during his travels. Instead, he wrote only that he had found unusual markings carved deep into a cluster of trees, and that he felt he was being watched. The message ended abruptly, almost as if it had been typed in a hurry. When he failed to check in again by nightfall, concern spread quickly through his close circle of friends. By the next morning, Bolden Marris was officially reported missing. News of his disappearance drew attention to Hemlock Isle for the first time in decades. Search and rescue teams were hesitant to board boats, claiming the weather conditions around the island had turned unpredictable overnight. Strong currents threatened to drag vessels off course, and sudden winds slammed against the waves with unnatural fury. It was as if the island itself resisted entry. Still, authorities insisted the mission proceed. The reputation of Bolden Marris meant pressure from the public came swiftly, and leaving him on the island without aid felt unthinkable. When the team finally broke through the fog and reached the shore, they found the island disturbingly still. No birds took flight from the trees. No insects stirred in the underbrush. Even the waves seemed muted as they washed onto the sand. The forest loomed ahead like a silent wall, dense and untouched. Yet, as the team moved inland, they realized they were not the first to step there. Fresh boot prints, too, large to belong to Bolden, trailed through the mud and vanished into the shadows of the trees. The discovery brought a chilling realization. Someone else had been on Hemlock Isle recently, and they were not accounted for in any local records. The island's mystery deepened instantly. What had Bolden seen? Who else was moving through the forest? And why did the carvings he described match no known markings from the region? Those unanswered questions marked the beginning of a case that would soon reveal the island's long-buried secrets far older, darker, and more deliberate than anyone had ever imagined. The cabin stood at the center of a small clearing, its wooden walls eaten by time and weather, its windows clouded with grime like blind eyes. It was the last known location of Bolden Marris, and it appeared exactly as the search team expected, abandoned, fragile, and unnervingly silent. But there was something unsettling about the place that no one could quite explain. The air inside felt heavier than the forest outside, as though the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to uncover what it had been hiding for years. The team entered carefully, noting the dust patterns on the floor. Nothing had been moved in a long time. A metal lantern sat on a table beside a cracked mug, and a threadbare blanket lay collapsed on a rotting cot. A faint smell of salt water drifted through the floorboards, mixing with the scent of mildew. Despite the decay, the interior was neatly arranged. Everything seemed intentionally placed, giving the impression that whoever had last lived here had left in a hurry, but with a sense of order. Bolden's equipment was nowhere to be found, which deepened the worry that he had left the structure in distressed state as the team searched. They noticed the north wall of the cabin had old gouges in the wood, almost like someone had dragged something heavy across it. Near those marks was a stack of firewood that appeared much newer than the rest of the cabin, as though it had been added recently. It was behind this neat stack of wood that one searcher noticed a slight gap in the floor. The plank there didn't match the others. It sat crooked, raised at one corner as if someone had pried it open and closed it again hastily. Curiosity overpowered hesitation. The searcher knelt, removed the wood pile, and gently lifted the odd floorboard. Beneath it lay a shallow compartment filled with debris dirt, fallen leaves, fragments of rope, and a water-stained book bound in cracked leather. The journal was surprisingly heavy despite its ruined appearance. Its pages were warped, the ink bleeding in places where moisture had soaked through, but enough remained legible to reveal its importance. The name written inside the cover in shaky handwriting was Rhett Calden, a former park ranger who had disappeared more than 30 years earlier. His case had never been solved. The first entries described routine patrols, weather reports, and wildlife movements. They read like any ranger's daily log. But as the pages continued, the tone shifted. Rhett began recording strange occurrences on Hemlock Isle, distant screams that echoed across the cliffs at night, oddly shaped footprints that vanished between trees, and carvings on the trunks of pines that seemed to reappear in new places each morning. He noted seeing a dim lantern glow deep within the forest when no other person was supposed to be on the island. He wrote about feeling watched, much like Bolden had noted decades later. The deeper the team read, the more disturbing the entries became. Rhett wrote about finding animal remains arranged in spirals on the ground, as though part of some ritual. He mentioned hearing knocking sounds beneath the cabin floor after midnight, though he never discovered the source. He described waking up on multiple mornings to find his cabin door wide open, despite locking it the night before. His final entries grew frantic, filled with warnings scrawled repeatedly. "Do not go to the hollow view." The last coherent sentence he wrote hinted at something he had found there, something that convinced him he was no longer alone. This reference to Hollow View was deeply unsettling. It was not a name any of the search team recognized. Locals had never mentioned it during interviews, and it appeared in no official records or maps. It was as if the location had been deliberately removed from public knowledge. Yet both Rhett Calden and Bolden Marris had referenced unusual carvings, and both had vanished shortly afterward. That connection, though thin, felt impossible to ignore. The team stepped outside the cabin to examine the surrounding area again, hoping to find more clues. The forest seemed thicker now, as if closing in around the clearing. Even the breeze felt uneasy. While one of the team members scanned the tree line, another noticed faint carvings on a tree near the cabin. The markings resembled those Rhett described, sharp lines crossing into spirals, etched deeply into the bark. The symbols felt ancient, intentional, and impossible to categorize. With a journal in hand, the team knew their search had just begun. The cabin that once sheltered a ranger and later a photographer now stood as the center point of a disturbing pattern. Bolden's final message echoed through their minds. Someone or something had been watching him. And if Rhett's warnings were true, the darkest part of Hemlock Isle lay beyond the trees, at the mysterious place called Hollow View. The path to Hollow View was barely visible, swallowed by brambles and twisting roots that rose from the earth like skeletal fingers. The search team followed the faint directions pieced together from Rhett Calden's journal, moving cautiously as the forest grew darker and denser. Every step felt weighted with the island's strange stillness. Birds did not sing, branches did not sway, and even the air lacked its usual hum. It was as though the forest itself wanted Hollow View to remain hidden. The deeper the team traveled, the more they sensed that the place they were heading toward had remained untouched for reasons far more troubling than its remote location. After nearly an hour of navigating steep inclines and narrow passages between trees, the team reached a ridge overlooking the sea. The cliff edge was jagged with stone that had crumbled into sharp, uneven fragments. Below, black water churned in slow spirals, giving the impression of an endless pit rather than an ocean. This was Hollow View, a place that felt wrong before anyone even explored it. The ground near the edge was littered with strange artifacts, charcoal remnants of fires that seemed too small to be for warmth, and pieces of driftwood carved with the same spiraling marks found near the cabin dot as the investigators surveyed the cliff. One of them noticed an unusual wall of vines draped over the rock face. The growth was thick, oddly uniform, as if intentionally arranged to conceal something. When they pulled away the vines, the stone behind them revealed a narrow opening leading into darkness. The entrance was barely tall enough for an adult to crouch through, and the edges of the rock around it showed signs of chipping, suggesting someone had widened it long ago. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through the group. Whatever lay inside had been hidden deliberately. The tunnel beyond the entrance stretched downward at a sharp angle, the walls slick with moisture. The air grew colder and damper the farther they descended. A faint metallic smell lingered, mixed with earth and decay. After several minutes, the narrow passage opened into a chamber carved from stone. The room felt impossibly quiet, as if sound itself refused to echo within it. Old lantern hooks lined the walls, though no light remained. The ground was covered in thick dust except for a few distinct trails indicating recent movement. It was here that the team found the rusted cages. 5 of them stood in a crooked row against the far wall, each large enough to hold a person. Chains hung from iron rings bolted into the stone. Some of the cages contained scraps of fabric, buttons, and bone fragments. The realization hit the team with a crushing sense of dread. The chamber had been used to confine someone, possibly many people, over an extended period. This was no naturally formed cavern. It had been transformed into a holding site. As they continued to search the chamber, they discovered a pile of discarded objects pushed into a corner. Among them were a broken camera lens, a torn backpack strap, and a metal identification tag coated in dirt. When the team cleaned it, the engraved letters became clear. Seren Vale. The missing college student had vanished 5 years earlier while on a hiking trip in Vermont. Her case had baffled authorities at the time, but no one imagined her trail would lead to a secluded island hundreds of miles away. The presence of her tag here suggested she had been brought to Hemlock Isle and held in this underground chamber. The team documented everything, each discovery tightening the knot of fear in their stomachs. The cages, the markings, and the personal belongings all pointed to a long-running operation hidden beneath the island's isolation. But the most unsettling detail was the fresh footprints in the dust. Their shape and spacing indicated a single individual moving between the cages and the tunnel entrance. Not long before the team arrived, this meant someone was still using the chamber, someone aware of the island's secrets, someone who knew how to stay hidden. The team left Hollowview with a renewed urgency. The clues no longer pointed only to the disappearance of Bolden Marris or the decades-old vanishing of Rhett Calden. They pointed toward an active presence, one that might still be watching from somewhere within the pines above the cliff. The discovery at Hollowview changed everything. What the investigators had assumed was an old, abandoned site now appeared to be part of a living network, one maintained by someone who was still on the island. The fresh footprints found in the dust were a reminder that Hemlock Isle was not empty. Someone moved in the shadows, someone who knew the land better than any ranger or rescue worker. As the team continued their search, the forest seemed to shift around them. As though guiding or warning them with each step, they took Dot to widen their coverage. They sent drones above the treetops. Most flights returned only images of dense canopy and fog, but the final drone captured something startling. For a brief moment, it recorded a lone figure walking steadily through a patch of pine trees near the eastern cliffs. The figure's posture was rigid, the stride purposeful. Before the drone could get closer, the person vanished beneath the trees as if swallowed by the forest. The footage was short and blurry, but it was enough to prove that the island's present danger was not supernatural or imagined. Someone was out there. Following the drone's coordinates, the team carefully approached the area. The pines stood tall and motionless, their branches thick and intertwined. The ground was uneven, covered in layers of old needles that muffled every footstep. After moving deeper into the grove, they found a series of faint tracks leading downhill. The prints were wide and deeply set, belonging to someone who moved with confidence through terrain that challenged everyone else. The tracks eventually led to a small clearing hidden between two slopes. What they found there confirmed their growing suspicions. At the center of the clearing stood a shelter made entirely of scavenged materials, driftwood, rusted metal sheets, torn canvas, and lengths of rope stretched between branches. Unlike the abandoned cabin, the structure showed clear signs of recent use. A small fire pit contained worn ashes. A stash of containers held rainwater. A tattered sleeping roll lay unrolled beside a crate filled with canned food. Even more disturbing were the maps pinned to the interior walls. Each map displayed carefully drawn marks, paths, and dates. The markings tracked the movements of people who had traveled near or onto Hemlock Isle over the past 10 years. The items inside told an unmistakable story. They belonged to Corin Dallance, a skilled survivalist and former wilderness guide who had vanished from public view years earlier. Before disappearing, Corin had been the subject of multiple investigations. Though never convicted, he had been suspected in several abductions across multiple states. Witnesses often mentioned his uncanny ability to navigate dense forests and disappear without leaving a trace. The evidence found in the shelter connected him to every major disappearance tied to the island, including those of Seren Vale, Rhett Calden, and likely Bolden Marris. It became clear that Corin had not chosen Hemlock Isle by accident. He had transformed it into a personal hunting ground. Photographs scattered across. A small wooden table strengthened this theory. Some showed trails, campsites, and unsuspecting hikers captured from a distance. Others depicted portions of the island. No official maps had ever included secret passages, hidden shelters, and vantage points overlooking the mainland. Corin had studied everything, planned everything, and adapted to the landscape so completely that it was possible he could navigate the island blindfolded. And yet, despite the evidence of his presence, Corin himself was gone. No footprints left the shelter. No trails suggested a direction of escape. It was as if he had melted into the forest moments before the team arrived. The idea that he might be observing them from just beyond the tree line created a chilling tension that none of the team members could shake. The forest, already quiet, now felt predatory. As they inspected the area further, the investigators found something more troubling than Corin's maps. Wrapped in oilcloth was a small metal box containing items taken from the victims: a silver necklace belonging to Seren Vale, an engraved compass known to be owned by Rhett Calden, and a camera battery identical to the model used by Bolden Marris. These items formed a timeline of Corin's crimes, a collection of trophies kept not out of carelessness, but out of ritual. The discovery forced the team to reassess their situation. They were not simply searching for missing people anymore. They were tracking a predator who understood the land better than they ever could. And somewhere, hidden by the pines and fog, Corin Dallance was watching, planning his next move. The team left the shelter with a heavy realization. Hemlock Isle was not just a hiding place. It was a territory one carefully crafted by the man who controlled it. And now that outsiders had disturbed his domain, the island felt more dangerous than ever. The final sweep of Hemlock Isle began at dawn, when the fog was thin enough for the search team to see more than a few steps ahead. The discoveries at the driftwood shelter had left the investigators uneasy, knowing Corin Dallance could be watching from any shadow. With every hour that passed, the urgency increased. They needed answers, not only for Bolden Marris, but for every name quietly recorded in Corin's twisted timeline. The island, once dismissed as a barren patch of land, had become a sprawling maze of secrets waiting to be uncovered. The search led them toward the old quarry on the island's western side. Few had ventured near it during earlier sweeps due to unstable ground and deep drop-offs. Now it seemed the only place left unexplored. The quarry was a vast cavity carved into the earth, its stone walls stained with age and rain. Pools of dark water collected in its lower sections, reflecting the sky like black mirrors. The place felt abandoned, yet something about it carried the same unsettling energy as Hollowview, an unpleasant stillness that signaled they were stepping into somewhere important. As the team moved along the quarry's perimeter, they found an area where the ground had caved inward recently. Loose rocks scattered down into a narrow shaft barely visible from above. The collapse appeared fresh, as though triggered by recent movement or shifting weight. The team secured ropes and descended carefully, discovering an opening at the shaft's base that led into another series of tunnels. These passageways differed from the natural caves near Hollowview. The walls here bore tool marks, indicating someone had chipped and carved the tunnels manually over many years. The realization that Corin had shaped parts of the island by hand made the space feel claustrophobic. The tunnels branched into several small rooms, each one colder and darker than the last. One room contained makeshift furniture, wooden pieces assembled from crates and planks. Another housed old lanterns, boxes of nails, and lengths of rope. These supplies suggested the underground space was not just a hiding place, but a hub of activity used repeatedly. But the largest chamber was the most disturbing discovery. Its walls were covered with rows of dates etched into the stone, beginning 3 decades earlier and continuing all the way to the present year. Each date matched a known disappearance from different states. Some belonged to cases long forgotten, others to names that had filled news reports for months. The entries spanned from the earliest vanishing, linked to Rhett Calden, all the way to the day Bolden Marris sent his final message. The carved timeline offered chilling confirmation that Corin's operations had extended far beyond Hemlock Isle. The island was not the beginning of his crimes. It was the endpoint, a final destination for those he had taken. The quiet tunnel amplified the weight of this understanding. For years, people had disappeared without explanation, and here was the record of one man's hidden history. Carved with precision into cold stone dot in a corner of the chamber lay a torn jacket sleeve with patches of moss and dried mud clinging to it. The fabric matched the jacket identified as belonging to Corin Dallance. Finding it here suggested he had been in the chamber recently, possibly during or just before the collapse. However, there were no footprints in the dust, no tools displaced, and no signs of a struggle. It was as if the jacket had been placed there intentionally, left behind like a message or a decoy. Some investigators theorized that Corin had miscalculated the ground stability and fallen into the rising tide pools beneath the quarry. The water level below the tunnels shifted with every storm, and anyone caught at the wrong moment could easily be swept away. Others argued the opposite, that Corin, a master of escape, had planned the collapse to cover his disappearance, slipping out through some other exit or submerged passageway no one had yet discovered. Given his history and skill, the notion of an intentional escape seemed far more believable, despite weeks of searching beyond that point through cliffs, forests, tunnels, and shorelines. Corin Dallance was never found. No remains surfaced. No sightings were confirmed. Hemlock Isle was eventually sealed off, with officials citing safety hazards and unstable terrain. But the truth was far more unsettling. The island had become a monument to secrets that resisted closure. To this day, the dates carved into the stone remain the most haunting evidence of what happened there. And although the island stands silent again, many believe Corin is still alive, moving through some forgotten corner of the wilderness, waiting for the world to stop watching before he reappears. Hemlock Isle may be empty now, but its darkness endures, hidden in the places where no one dares to look.